Zoe's heart was pounding as she stood outside Brandon's family home, clutching her handbag tightly. The grand house, with its ivy-covered walls and towering oak trees lining the driveway, looked like something out of a storybook. Yet, the imposing nature of the house only heightened her anxiety. This wasn't just a casual visit. This was her introduction as Brandon's future wife. As Brandon opened the door, the warmth of the home greeted Zoe. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air, and she could hear soft laughter coming from the living room. Brandon placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Relax, Zoe," he said with a reassuring smile. "They're going to love you." Inside, Brandon's parents, Justin and Stella, were waiting. Justin, a tall man with a kind smile, extended his hand warmly. "Zoe, it's wonderful to finally meet you," he said. "Brandon has told us so much about you." Stella followed with a gentle embrace, her warm demeanor easing some of Zoe's nerves. "Welcome to our home, Zoe. Make yourself comfortable," she said, her voice soothing and inviting. As they guided Zoe into the living room, the space exuded elegance and history. Family portraits adorned the walls, and antique furniture gave the room a timeless charm. Sitting by the window was Grace, Brandon's older sister. With her striking features and polished appearance, she looked every bit like someone who belonged in a grand house like this. Grace rose from her seat and approached Zoe with a dazzling smile. "Hi, Zoe," she said, her voice bright and welcoming. "It's so nice to meet you. Brandon has told me a lot about you." Her charm and warmth seemed genuine, and Zoe felt a flicker of hope that the visit would go smoothly. The initial conversation was pleasant. Grace asked about Zoe's work as a teacher, and they shared light laughter about classroom anecdotes. For a moment, Zoe felt at ease, believing she might truly fit into Brandon's family. But the atmosphere shifted abruptly when Brandon excused himself to take a call. Grace's warm smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "So," she began, her tone sharp and dismissive. "You're a teacher. That's nice, I suppose. But do you really think that's enough for this family?" Zoe froze, her confidence wavering under Grace's icy gaze. The friendly tone of the evening had vanished, leaving behind an unsettling tension. In that moment, Zoe realized that earning the acceptance of Brandon's family, especially Grace, was going to be far more challenging than she had anticipated. As Brandon stepped out of the room to take a phone call, Zoe tried to remain composed. She sipped her tea, attempting to focus on the ornate decor of the room, but the shift in Grace's demeanor was impossible to ignore. The warmth and friendliness Grace had shown earlier vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp tone. "So," Grace began, her voice laced with disdain. "You're a teacher. How quaint." Her lips curled into a mocking smile as she looked Zoe up and down. "Tell me, Zoe, do you think someone like you fits into a family like ours? Teaching is respectable, of course, but let's face it, it's not exactly prestigious." Zoe blinked, stunned by the sudden change. "I love what I do," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Teaching is my passion, and I believe it makes a difference." Grace scoffed, leaning back in her chair with an air of superiority. "Oh, I'm sure it does. But let me ask you this. How will you handle being part of a family that operates on a completely different level? This house, this legacy, it takes more than passion. It takes sophistication, connections, and, let's be honest, money." Zoe felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger, but she kept quiet, hoping Grace's tirade would end. Instead, it escalated. "Look at your outfit," Grace said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's charmingly outdated. Did you pick it up at a thrift store? It's almost embarrassing to imagine you standing next to Brandon." The insult stung, but Zoe swallowed her hurt, unwilling to give Grace the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Grace, however, was far from done. She picked up a glass of water from the table, smirking as she held it in her hand. "You know," she said, her tone icy, "Brandon deserves someone who can compliment him. Someone who won't drag him down." Before Zoe could react, Grace flung the water at her, soaking her blouse and leaving her stunned. The cold liquid dripped from her face as she sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Grace leaned back, feigning innocence. "Oh no, the floor's wet," she said mockingly. "You should clean that up. After all, that's your specialty, isn't it?" Zoe's eyes welled with tears, but she bit her lip to hold them back. She glanced at Brandon's parents, hoping for some intervention, but JN and Stella exchanged awkward glances and muttered weakly, "Let's not make a fuss." The silence from her future in-laws felt like a betrayal. Zoe excused herself, retreating to the kitchen to compose herself. As she dabbed at her wet clothes with a towel, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Brandon, his expression dark with concern. "Zoe, what happened?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. When she hesitated, he gently placed a hand on her arm. "Tell me." Taking a shaky breath, Zoe recounted the incident, her voice breaking as she described Grace's cruel words and actions. Brandon's jaw tightened, and a storm of anger brewed in his eyes. "Stay here," he said firmly, striding out of the kitchen. The sound of Brandon's voice echoed through the house as he confronted Grace. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "How could you treat Zoe like that?" Grace rolled her eyes, feigning innocence. "Oh, come on, Brandon. I was just joking. She needs to toughen up if she's going to be part of this family. That's enough." Brandon snapped, his voice firm. "Zoe is not just my fiancée. She's my partner, and you'll respect her. Apologize."
"Now."
Grace faltered, her confident facade cracking under Brandon's anger. She crossed her arms defensively, but didn't argue further. Brandon turned to his parents, his voice heavy with disappointment. "And you," he said, "why didn't you stop this? Your silence says everything." JN and Stella looked down, ashamed but still silent. Brandon returned to the kitchen, his anger melting into concern as he took Zoe's hand. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said softly. "But I promise, I won't let her treat you like this again." In that moment, Zoe felt both hurt and comforted, knowing Brandon was firmly by her side despite the turmoil. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the tense atmosphere, interrupting the silence that had settled after Brandon's confrontation with Grace. A deep, steady voice called out, "Sorry I'm late." Footsteps approached the living room, and a tall, well-dressed man appeared in the doorway. His warm smile and confident demeanor immediately lightened the room's mood. "Hi, everyone," he said. "I just got back from my trip." Zoe glanced up, wiping the last remnants of tears from her cheeks. The man's gaze shifted to her, and his expression changed from polite curiosity to surprise. "Wait a second," he said, stepping closer. "Are you Zoe?" Confused, Zoe hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I'm Zoe," she replied, unsure of where this was going. Joshua's face lit up with recognition. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "You're the Zoe who helped my mother after my dad passed away. She used to talk about you all the time, how you were a godsend during those difficult months. She always said you were like family." Tears sprang to Zoe's eyes at Joshua's heartfelt words. "I'm glad I could be there for her," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Joshua's smile faded as his eyes darted between Zoe and Grace, noticing Zoe's damp clothes and the tension in the room. His tone turned serious. "What happened here?" he asked sharply, his gaze locking onto Grace. "Why is Zoe soaking wet?" Grace's face went pale, and she stammered, "I didn't mean to." Joshua's expression hardened. "Grace, what did you do?" "It was just a stupid joke," Grace muttered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think." "Clearly you didn't," Joshua interrupted, his tone firm. "Zoe is the woman who brought comfort to our family during one of the darkest times of our lives. And this is how you treat hers?" Grace's composure began to crack as Joshua's words sank in. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she said defensively, her voice trembling. "I just—" "Enough," Joshua said, cutting her off. "You need to take responsibility for your actions, Grace. This behavior is unacceptable." The room fell silent as Grace's defensive posture crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice breaking. I don't know why I acted that way." Joshua crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. Then explain it. What's going on with you? For the first time that evening, Grace's polished exterior fell away completely. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I'm jealous, she admitted, her voice muffled but raw with emotion. Zoe's worked so hard for everything she has. She's accomplished, confident, and kind. And me? I've always had everything handed to me. Everything but real purpose. I feel useless compared to her, and I lashed out because I didn't know how to deal with it. Her confession hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Even Zoe, who had borne the brunt of Grace's cruelty, couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. Grace looked up, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, Zoe, she said, her voice trembling. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. Zoe hesitated, torn between anger and understanding. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. I appreciate your apology, Grace. I know it takes courage to admit when you're wrong. But words aren't enough. You need to show through your actions that you're willing to change. Joshua nodded in agreement, his stern expression softening slightly.
She's right, Grace.
This isn't just about Zoe. You need to figure out who you are and what you want out of life. It's time to stop blaming others and start taking responsibility. Grace nodded, wiping her tears. I will, she said quietly. I promise I'll try. The tension in the room began to ease as Grace's vulnerability brought a sense of closure to the confrontation. Brandon, who had been watching silently, took Zoe's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. Let's go, he said gently. We've had enough for one day. As Zoe and Brandon left, Joshua stayed behind, sitting beside Grace and offering her a comforting hand on her shoulder. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to be truly seen, not as the perfect, untouchable older sister, but as someone grappling with insecurities and striving to grow. It was a beginning, fragile yet hopeful. Zoe often found herself reflecting on how her life had changed since meeting Brandon. He had come into her world like a quiet storm, transforming it in ways she hadn't expected. Their connection wasn't built on grand gestures or whirlwind romance, but on steady, unwavering support that anchored her through life's storms. The challenges with Grace and the tension in Brandon's family tested their bond in ways neither had anticipated. Yet, each trial seemed to pull them closer together rather than driving them apart. Brandon's steadfastness gave Zoe the strength she needed to navigate the complexities of her new reality. One evening, as they sat on the couch in Zoe's modest apartment, Brandon took her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her fingers. I'm sorry about everything you've had to face with my family, he said, his voice tinged with regret. You deserve better. Zoe looked at him, her eyes soft but resolute. Brandon, I'm not going to lie, it's been hard. But I knew what I was getting into when I fell in love with you. Families aren't perfect, and I'm not expecting yours to be. What matters to me is us, and how we handle it together. Brandon's lips curved into a small smile. I'm lucky to have you, he said. I don't know how you stay so calm, even when things get overwhelming. Zoe chuckled lightly. You give me more credit than I deserve. Inside, I'm a mess most of the time. But you make me feel like I can handle anything. Their relationship had grown stronger in the quiet, everyday moments like these. Cooking dinner together after long workdays, sharing stories about their childhoods, and laughing over silly inside jokes. They had built a foundation of trust and understanding, and even in the face of Grace's hostility, Zoe knew she wasn't alone. One night, after a particularly rough day dealing with Grace's snide remarks and icy attitude, Zoe broke down in Brandon's arms. I don't think I can keep doing this, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. No matter how hard I try. It feels like I'll never be good enough for them. Brandon held her tightly, his voice firm but gentle. You are more than enough, Zoe. Don't let Grace's insecurities make you doubt your worth. I see you for who you are, strong, compassionate, and brilliant. And I love you for it. His words were like a balm to her wounded heart, and she realized how deeply she trusted him. Brandon wasn't just her partner. He was her safe place, her cheerleader, and her rock. With him, she felt seen and valued in ways she hadn't experienced before. Their love wasn't without its struggles, but it was these very challenges that made their bond unshakable. Together, they learned to face life's difficulties with resilience and grace, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could weather any storm. For Zoe, that certainty was worth more than anything. Grace's world unraveled the day Joshua walked out of their marriage. The foundation she had built her life upon, a blend of privilege, appearances, and dependency, crumbled in an instant. For years, she had leaned on others to navigate life. Her parents' overprotectiveness, her husband's financial stability, and the social status that came with her family name. Now, she was left to face the harsh reality of life on her own. The divorce was a wake-up call Grace hadn't anticipated. Joshua's parting words, though SPO Joshua calmly, echoed in her mind. You need to figure out who you are, Grace. You can't keep tearing others down because you don't know how to build yourself up. Those words haunted her, forcing her to confront the person she had become. Initially, Grace struggled with the simplest tasks. Paying bills, grocery shopping, and even managing a budget felt overwhelming. Her bank account, once generously supported by her husband, now dwindled quickly. For the first time in her life, Grace had to confront the reality of living without a safety net. The isolation was unbearable. The friends who once flocked to her for glamorous parties and extravagant dinners disappeared when her status faded. One day, while scrolling through job postings with a mix of frustration and dread, Grace stumbled upon an opening at a local boutique. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was modest, but something about the idea of contributing to a small business appealed to her. Swallowing her pride, she applied and, to her surprise, got the job. Working at the boutique was a humbling experience. Grace started at the bottom, folding clothes, greeting customers, and handling inventory. The work was repetitive and physically tiring, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. For the first time, she earned her own money, however little it was, and the feeling of independence was surprisingly rewarding. Through her job, Grace began to see the world from a perspective she had long ignored. Her coworkers, many of whom juggled multiple responsibilities like school, family, and work, inspired her. She learned the value of hard work and began to appreciate the resilience of those who faced far greater challenges than she ever had. Gradually, her entitlement gave way to humility. Grace's journey wasn't without setbacks. There were nights she cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by loneliness and regret. But those moments of despair also became turning points. She started to reflect deeply on her past behavior, particularly how she had treated Zoe. The memory of Zoe's tear-streaked face and Brandon's furious defense haunted her. For years, Grace had built herself up by tearing others down, projecting her insecurities onto those who threatened her fragile sense of self-worth. Now, she realized how deeply flawed that approach had been. Determined to change, Grace sought help. She began attending therapy, where she unpacked her childhood and the toxic patterns she had developed over the years. For the first time, she acknowledged how her parents' overprotectiveness and constant validation had stifled her growth. She realized that she had never truly been challenged to take responsibility for her actions or find her own identity. Therapy also helped Grace identify the root of her jealousy toward Zoe. It wasn't just that Zoe had worked hard for everything she had. It was that Zoe's confidence and kindness highlighted Grace's own shortcomings. Zoe embodied qualities Grace admired but had never cultivated in herself. Accepting this truth was painful, but it was also liberating. Over time, Grace began to make amends, starting with small gestures. She apologized to her coworkers for moments of impatience and arrogance, earning their respect as she demonstrated genuine growth. At work, she took on more responsibilities, eventually being promoted to assistant manager. Her newfound confidence wasn't rooted in status or appearances, but in the knowledge that she could stand on her own 2 feet. One day, months after her divorce, Grace spotted Zoe at a local coffee shop. Zoe was seated by the window, sipping her drink and reading a book. Grace hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but then gathered her courage. She walked over, her heart pounding. "Zoe," she said softly. Zoe looked up, surprised but calm. "Grace," she replied, her tone neutral. Grace took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say,
I'm sorry. For everything.
the way I treated you was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I know I hurt you deeply. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better." Zoe studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I can see that you're working on yourself, Grace. And that's what matters." The exchange, though brief, left Grace feeling lighter. It wasn't absolution, but it was a step toward healing. Grace's transformation was far from complete, but she was finally on the right path. She had learned to take responsibility for her actions, to value hard work, and to find meaning in her independence. Most importantly, she had discovered that true growth comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt proud, not of what she had, but of who she was becoming. Months had passed since the stormy confrontation at Brandon's family home, and the wounds from that day were slowly healing. Grace had embarked on a journey of self-improvement, but one thing still weighed heavily on her heart: making amends with Zoe. She knew she couldn't fully move forward without addressing the hurt she had caused. On a quiet Sunday morning, Grace called Zoe. Her voice was hesitant but sincere. "Zoe, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but could we meet? There's something I need to say." Zoe, surprised but willing, agreed. They met at a small cafe, the same one where Zoe and Brandon often spent quiet moments together. Grace arrived early, her hands nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup. When Zoe walked in, Grace stood up, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and hope. "Thank you for coming," Grace began, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking a lot about everything I said and did to you. I was cruel, disrespectful, and," she paused, taking a deep breath, "and so unfair. I lashed out because I was insecure and jealous. You've worked so hard for everything you have, and it made me realize how much I've been hiding behind my own privileges and failures. I'm truly sorry, Zoe." Zoe listened intently, her expression calm but thoughtful. She could see the sincerity in Grace's eyes and hear it in her voice. When Grace finished, Zoe placed a hand gently on hers. "I appreciate your apology, Grace," she said softly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I can see you've been working hard to change." "I forgive you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'll keep proving that I've changed." In the weeks that followed, the relationship dynamics within Brandon's family began to shift. Grace, humbled by her experiences, made genuine efforts to reconnect with Zoe and Brandon. She stopped taking family gatherings for granted and started contributing meaningfully, showing kindness and respect toward Zoe. Zoe, in turn, encouraged Grace's growth, recognizing the strength it took for her to change. The family, once fractured by tension, began to heal. Slowly but surely, trust was rebuilt, and a new sense of harmony emerged. The journey wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for Zoe and Grace, that was enough. Months after her journey of self-discovery began, Grace found herself standing outside Brandon and Zoe's home, clutching a bouquet of flowers. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the quiet street. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage she needed to take the next step. When Zoe opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. "Grace," she said softly, stepping aside to let her in. Grace's hands trembled as she set the flowers on the table and turned to face Zoe. "I need to say this," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Zoe, I am so sorry for the way I treated you. I was cruel, judgmental, and unfair. I let my insecurities control me, and I lashed out at you because I saw in you everything I wished I could be: kind, strong, and confident." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes, but she stayed quiet, letting Grace continue. "I can't take back what I said or did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be a better person. You didn't deserve the way I treated you, and I hope you can forgive me." Zoe studied Grace for a moment, her gaze softening. "Grace," she said gently. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong. I can see how much you've grown, and I forgive you. We all have struggles, and I'm glad you're finding your way. The two women hugged, their embrace a quiet symbol of forgiveness and a fresh start. Over time, the family dynamic began to shift. Grace worked to rebuild her relationships with Brandon, Zoe, and her parents, demonstrating her sincerity through her actions. The renewed bond brought a sense of peace and unity to the family, proving that even the deepest rifts could be mended with time, effort, and genuine change. Life for Zoe and Brandon blossomed into a beautiful partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering support. The trials they had faced together only deepened their love and strengthened their bond. Brandon often marveled at Zoe's resilience. "You've faced so much, and yet you've stayed kind and strong," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I'm so proud of you." Zoe smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "And I'm grateful for you, Brandon. You've stood by me through everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Their days were filled with simple joys, shared meals, quiet walks, and dreams for the future. Zoe found herself at peace, not only with her relationship but also with the person she had become. Her patience and perseverance had paid off, and she now felt a deep contentment in her life. As Zoe held Brandon's hand, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for her, that certainty was enough to fill her world with hope and happiness.